Let me see if my machine works. So we want to go through kind of just a background on Autopilot, then do a side-by-side walkthrough of the original Autopilot version and what I call Autopilot V2, even though they don't like it being called Autopilot V2. Don't care. During that, we'll talk about some of the low-level traffic, and let's just get started in it. So for those that need a recap, basically Autopilot V1 was designed and released to simplify the Windows out-of-box experience. Of course, Microsoft is the one who made that experience complicated in the first place, so that's typical Microsoft. Let's make something really complicated and then release a fancy feature to simplify it. So it's designed to hide things that you may not want to see during the UBI process, as well as adding additional scenarios on top of what the out-of-box experience otherwise could do to let you configure things like admin versus non-admin, scenarios around Entra ID versus Azure AD, Active Directory join, self-deploying, pre-provisioning. All of those additional scenarios build on top of the basic functionality that was already in UBI, which didn't do a whole lot other than ask you a bunch of questions and try to get you to opt into other Microsoft services. But at least with an Autopilot V1 registered device that had a profile assigned to it, you would go through a nice simplified process that the end user could complete to get a device into Entra or Active Directory and enrolled in Intune and fully provisioned. Doing that required registering the device with a hardware hash. In most cases, there was Autopilot for existing devices, which supported registration, not really registration, but deployment using a JSON file dropped into the right place on the device. That continues to work, but it requires enabling personal device enrollment to get that to work. So as a result of that, it's not quite as popular as it used to be, when it would basically provide a way of bypassing that personal device and enrollment restriction. So you register the device, you assign a profile, you deploy the machine out, and the rules that are applied to the machine are included in that Autopilot profile as part of the provisioning process. I've talked to a bunch of people over the years who've said, I'm deploying using Autopilot, but yet when we would actually dig into it, they had no registered devices, they had no Autopilot profiles, they hadn't done any of the Autopilot configuration, but they were still using Autopilot. So what exactly were they doing? Well, they were just going through the UBI process and doing an Entra ID join with all the extra screens added in, and potentially even using the enrollment status page, since you can use that even for non-Autopilot devices. But they just saw that as Autopilot. What is Autopilot? It's the way of getting a device joined to Entra ID and enrolled in Intune via UBI. Well, that's not quite Autopilot. That's really just the standard UBI flow. Autopilot provides those additional scenarios. It makes sure that the devices are enrolled as corporate devices. It makes sure that users don't get admin rights if that's what you want. So there are advantages for the Autopilot registered devices and the optimized Autopilot flow over just the default UBI behaviors. But if you're just looking for a modern mechanism to get a device joined to Entra ID and enrolled in Intune, where the user gets admin rights and can navigate their way through a bunch of questions during the process, then you don't even need Autopilot. You can just have them go through the UBI process natively without any configuration at all, for that matter. If we look at the history, Autopilot goes back to 2017. It was introduced in Windows 10 1703. That was in response to IBM's Mac at IBM program. Nothing causes a panic like IBM releasing press that talks about how wonderful Mac devices are and how easy they are to deploy and provision, and they're making them available to all IBM employees. That's what triggered the work around Autopilot. Initially, it only supported user-driven Azure AD join, so the initial scenario was pretty much what you could do normally in Ubi. 2018 then added the enrollment status page so that you could block until the provisioning process was complete, as users get confused when they end up at the desktop and there's nothing there and they had to wait for everything else to get installed in the background. Hybrid Azure AD join support was added in 2018, self-deploying mode, Windows Autopilot for existing devices. So all of those features built on top of that initial base. 2019 added pre-provisioning support, previously called White Glove. And then from 2020 to 2023, not much happened. As far as Autopilot goes, there were plenty of changes going on in Intune to provide additional capabilities there, but Autopilot itself was pretty much stabilized. The next big change then was in 2024, just about a year ago, where Autopilot device preparation, which is a mouthful, hence why I call it Autopilot v2. That was introduced with Windows 11 24H2 or 22 or 23H2 if you had the April 2024 patch installed. So, what is this new thing? What is Autopilot device preparation or Autopilot v2? It is a new parallel mechanism for provisioning devices. It doesn't replace Autopilot v1, hence it's probably not really a v2, but internally it was called v2, so we'll keep calling it that. It doesn't replace it. It provides a new mechanism that changes the behaviors overall. The interesting thing, if you're looking through the documentation for Autopilot, you'll now see that there are two completely different sets of documentation. There's the original one for V1, which was pretty much left unchanged. And then there's a brand new set for Autopilot device preparation. That leads to some interesting things like the note at the top of the page. This article is for Autopilot device preparation for Windows Autopilot. See overview of Windows Autopilot. Sounds like a recursive reference, but it's really just telling you that Windows Autopilot, that's the original thing. Windows Autopilot device preparation, that's the new thing. That's V2. Microsoft did say that there's a possibility of backporting some of the V2 enhancements to V1, like the new enrollment status page UI with a nice simple circular progress bar. Maybe that could be backported. I would say that there's somewhere around a 0% chance of that ever happening, but
one hand.
it could happen. But they did leave that open in the original enhancements. There was also an initial statement that made it sound like Autopilot v1 would eventually be replaced by Autopilot v2. And after people pointed that out, Microsoft conveniently scrubbed that from all the docs. So I think for now, we're looking at long-term coexistence between the two. If everyone went to v2, would v1 go away? Yes, but as we go through this, I think you'll see scenarios where people would choose to stay on v1 for the long term rather than moving to v2. V2 in the original release talked about all the things that were coming later, and here we are a year later, and later still hasn't arrived. So there's still work to be done. Autopilot v2 is clearly a work in progress. There is no way to turn off some Ubi pages. There's no way to specify device naming templates. There's no self-deploying or pre-provisioning mode. There's just plenty of limitations that we'll see when we go through this and compare it side by side. Now, in the initial blog postings that talked about this, one of the big enhancements or one of the big advantages of Autopilot v2 was that you didn't need to register devices with the Autopilot service. You could just assign an Autopilot V2 profile to a user group, and then anyone who is in that user group will go through the Autopilot V2 process. The challenge with that, though, goes back to what we had talked about before, personal device enrollment restrictions. If you block personal device enrollments for Windows devices, Autopilot V2 won't work because it's going to go through the enrollment as a personal device and then flip over to a corporate device after it's enrolled. So if you're blocking that, which most customers do, you would still have to register the devices. You just register them differently. Instead of registering with the Autopilot service, you register them with a corporate device identifier. So that corporate device identifier is an Intune specific thing that enables Intune to recognize that this device is known to Intune and therefore should be treated as a corporate device. So no Autopilot registration, but there is corporate device identifier registration. So the net effect is you still need to register devices. There's some other interesting side effects of that, like if you pay an OEM or a reseller to register the devices for you, they can do that with the Autopilot service for V1, but they can't create corporate device identifiers, at least at this point. Maybe that'll change. But for now, you have to do that yourself. Fortunately, those corporate device identifiers are the simple tuple manufacturer model serial number, so at least the registration process doesn't require that full 4K hash. There is one feature that Microsoft hates, so they were very, very specific in calling out that hybrid Azure AD join will never be supported in Autopilot V2. Okay, not a big deal.
Is that the only thing that's not into that goes in the law?
That's the only thing they said they wouldn't bring.
Is that mostly a documentation thing? Or is it still like, did they intentionally block it?
They just don't have support in there for it. So could you make it work? Probably. But out of the box, they really want everyone to go cloud native. All right. So most useful way of looking at them is just kind of walk through the process for both of them side by side. So if we look at the devices booting up for the first time, no big differences between them, at least initially. Windows starts up for the first time. And we get to a point where we can make a network connection. All right, so at this point, there's zero difference visibly, although behind the scenes, there is a little bit of different activity going on. So on the left, the Autopilot V1 process, after that network connection was established, it reached out to the Autopilot service and asked, am I an Autopilot device? And the Autopilot service replied back saying, yes, here's your Autopilot profile. In the Autopilot V2 case, it still reached out to the Autopilot V1 service, but the Autopilot V1 service responded back to say, no, you're not an Autopilot device. So at this point, not a whole lot of visible differences, but you can see if you look at the responses coming back from the service, which end up getting written into JSON files on the computer, you can see that we got the Autopilot profile setting, first case for Autopilot V1, but for Autopilot V2, we just got an error 807 back saying the device isn't registered. In Autopilot V1, you could skip the language, keyboard, and layout if you had a wired connection, because that Autopilot profile would come down as soon as that wired connection was available. In the Wi-Fi case, you can't, because you have to go through those screens to make the Wi-Fi connection to then download the profile. In Autopilot V2, there's no way.
Session.
Yeah. What was the question?
Mike, I think.
Oh, okay. We'll keep going. So in Autopilot V2, no way to disable the language keyboard. And as we get into this deeper, we'll see there's no way to set the computer name either. So we've made the network connection. The Autopilot V1 machine at this point would go directly to the logon page for the user to put in their credentials. Autopilot V2 has some more work to do first. It displays the EULA because this isn't a registered device. We don't know to skip it. It asks for the computer name, and then it reboots to establish the computer name. Now, that assumes the device is running Pro. If the device is running Enterprise, it won't prompt for the computer name. Only Pro does that for some reason, but in the Enterprise case, it'll always pick a random name.
So enterprise name, you can't set it and it doesn't prompt. So it's just always random.
Always random. You'd have to rename it later. Fortunately, with Entra ID, that's not a big deal. Name can be changed at any time. And eventually it syncs back to Intune and Entra and everything's happy. But just no naming mechanism provided otherwise.
To rename it, or is there some way to automate that, or?
Can it be automated? Yeah, it's a one-line PowerShell command to set the new
You're
name.
able to create a little pop-up that asks the key questions to build the name, and then the script builds the name.
Yeah, and that's a headache, but it does work.
But it works.
Yeah. All right, so now both of them will be at a point of typing in credentials. In the Autopilot V1 case, you might have also seen a critical update reboot. Actually, in both cases, there can be a 0-day patch installed on the machine. But in the Autopilot V2 case, you also had to accept the EULA, type in the computer name, and you'll also choose personal versus work or school. There's no way to automate that. The device doesn't know. Is it a personal device? Is it a work school device? Again, that's on Pro. On Enterprise, it always assumes work versus school. Could they fix that? Yes. To do that would require tagging the machine with tenant details, but for right now, there's no way of doing that. So you then get to the logon page. If you look closely at these logon pages, you'll see that they're different. On the left, it's branded. So it displays the company logo, company name, and company specific help text. Please contact Microsoft if you have any issues. On the right, you just get a generic Entra ID sign-in page. That makes sense because in the Autopilot V1 case, it already knows what tenant this device is associated with, so it can present the branded page, whereas on the Autopilot V2 case, all it can do is display a generic login page. Now, as soon as you put in your user ID, your email address, your UPN, whatever you want to type in, at that point, it can switch to a branded page for the password, but at least for the initial sign-in page, it's not branded. In the Autopilot V1 case, as soon as you put in the user ID and password, it sends down an enrollment package that has a bunch of settings embedded in it for the ESP and a variety of other things, including timeouts and error messages and that kind of thing. In the Autopilot V2 case, it sends down what looks like a more simplified and streamlined configuration, which mainly is just a timeout. But if you actually dig into one of the lines there, there is a line here that says Bootstrapper agent. That Bootstrapper agent configuration looks like it's nice and short. But if we dig into that, we can see that it's actually huge. So the V1 case is just the first sync policies. The case, has some simple timeouts and error messages, but everything else is in a very large JSON payload for the Bootstrapper agent. So what the heck is a Bootstrapper agent? In this case, the Bootstrapper agent is the Intune management extension. The Intune management extension is doing all the work. So it's effectively Windows saying, I've enrolled a device, I've received this payload. I don't have any idea what this payload is. I'm just going to hand it off to the bootstrapper agent and it's going to take care of that. So in this, the bootstrapper agent for Intune specifically has a variety of providers, one to configure standard users, one to do, I forget exactly what that one is, SLDM. We'll talk more about that. PowerShell provider and a Win32 app provider.
Hmm.
So if we look at that, basically, these are the phases that the process will go through as the device is being provisioned. But all of those phases are implemented in the Intune management extension. So why would you want to do that? Effectively, it takes the whole provisioning process out of Windows. What's left in Windows? It's just the UI to display the progress, which is being fed information by the bootstrapper agent to choose what it should display. And everything else is in external code. So you, as part of the enrollment process, you would download this bootstrapper agent, the Intune management extension, install it, and then it takes over the process from there. So how often could Microsoft change the bootstrapper agent, Intune management extension? Daily, if they really wanted to. They generally update it at least once a month. So they could be adding additional functionality at any time. So in theory, that's a great thing because they can keep adding functionality whenever they feel like it.
Also, they keep it consistent across Windows versions. Well, before you could add different parts in Windows doing different.
Yeah, you never have the dependency on Windows to wait for the next release.
So this is like a great thing, right, Michael? Or
Yeah.
any negatives?
No negatives. The only question is, when are they going to use it?
Yeah.
That's the different challenge is, all right, it's been there for a year and yeah, you have the ability to change it every month. They haven't changed it every month. They fixed a couple of things. Otherwise it hasn't changed. We'll also see as we go through this, the new UI for displaying progress is being fed basically a percent complete number by the bootstrapper agent, so Intune management extension. And the implementation of that is brain dead. We'll see why as we get into this, but it's the bare minimum. What would you do if you needed to bare minimum progress display during a process?
And that's all V2. And implementation, the whole V1 stuff, I imagine, is still in Windows.
All still as it was before. So yeah, it's not changing, but it is baked.
V2 stuff isn't right now either.
All right, so in Autopilot V1, devices are always corporate. Autopilot existing devices, we already talked about that. Admin rights are configured in the Autopilot profile. Autopilot V2, they enroll as personal and then they flip after they're enrolled, hence the need for the corporate device identifiers. The other advantage for Autopilot V2, the V1 support only exists in the public cloud. So you can't use it with government clouds. Autopilot V2 works just fine with any cloud that Intune works with. So high security government clouds are just fine. There was an initial issue, I think it's been resolved since then, but you can configure admin rights for a machine in the Autopilot V2 profile and in Entra. And if those two don't match, the process blows up. So don't do that. If you're going to configure them in places, make sure they have the same settings. All right, so when we put in our password, we now start basically a bootstrapping process. In both Autopilot V1 and Autopilot V2, we need the Intune management extension to specify the Win32 apps that should be installed. So in both cases, we do the enrollment, it downloads the Intune management extension, it calculates what Win32 apps are needed, and then the process continues. Autopilot V2 case is doing a little bit more. It also figures out what PowerShell scripts need to be run, and it understands how to provide progress back to the Intune service and a few other things going on in the background. But effectively, they're doing the same thing. So why is Autopilot V1 taking 3 minutes and Autopilot V2 taking 2 minutes and 15 seconds. Where'd that 45 seconds go? There is a feature that was implemented as part of Autopilot V2 called enrollment time grouping. So basically, you create an Autopilot profile, Autopilot V2 profile, device preparation profile. You target that to a group of users. You associate that with a machine group. So any user that signs in to enroll on a machine, that machine gets dropped into the machine group. All right, what good does that do? That machine group, Intune has pre-calculated all the policies to target to that machine group. So it already knows what apps are needed for any machine that gets dropped into that group. So it doesn't need to think about it as long. So the net result is you save 45 seconds on this process because it doesn't need to calculate as much. Now we can see the progress bar on the right-hand side. As it goes through, it will basically count up. It got to 3% and then it was finished. What does that 3% mean? Basically, that 3% is the percent of the maximum time that has elapsed. So let's say you configure a maximum time of 100 minutes. 100 minutes means it's going to go to 1% at 1 minute, 2% at 2 minutes, 3% at 3 minutes. What if the whole process takes, like this one, 40 minutes? Going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10, 20, 30, 40, 100. Because it's just really marking the passage of time. It's not actually reporting progress. But in both cases, we downloaded the IME. IME got installed. It figured out what apps and other things needed to be done. And then this phase of the process is done. In the next phase, it starts to do more interesting things to track the apps. So APV1, there are other things that can happen in the background, actually on both APV1 and V2. Other MSIs that you target to the machine can install during that phase. And if you use the Microsoft 365 apps app type, it can install in the background at that point as well. It's only the Win32 apps and PowerShell scripts that come later.
That will be a business app,
Sorry?
emphasize or line of business.
Line of business, yes. So then we get into the long part of the process, which are the application installs. And technically, Autopilot V2 also does PowerShell scripts. So it's just Win32 apps for Autopilot V1. V2 is Win32 apps plus PowerShell scripts. In my case, I do have a PowerShell script or two, but they don't take anything more than like a second or two. So there's no difference in timing for the app installs. It's the same set of apps in both cases. So why does Autopilot V1 take 20 minutes and Autopilot V2 takes 25? You would expect them to take the same amount of time. It's the same apps because you're not going to see them run differently in one versus the other. We'll see it as we go through, but it really should be the same. It should take 20 minutes for each one of them. However, one of my apps reboots the computer. It sets a return code to indicate that the machine should restart. So there's a coalesced restart at the end of the process. And in the Autopilot V1 case, it reboots the computer. After the computer starts back up again, ESP looks and says, oh, I'm already done. There's nothing else that needs to be completed. In Autopilot V2, it sits there and spins for minutes before it comes back, and it too says, oh, I'm done too, and completes the process. So there's something wrong in the Autopilot V2 case. Apparently they're going to fix that soon. So we should see an updated Intune management extension soon that solves that particular problem. But Until then, yeah, any reboots are going to add minutes to the process until they can take care of that. But you can see the percentage counting up, 23, 24, 25. You can see various flashes on the screen from the weird apps that I'm running on the machine. I think Pac-Man will even flash up at some point. But I think it gets to 40 or 41 before it jumps to 100. It's just the amount of time that it takes. But the idea behind the UI is reasonable. End users with the enrollment status page got too much information. They didn't understand it. With Autopilot V2, they get just a simple progress bar. It's not a real progress bar, but it's at least a simple progress bar. It would be nice if it included just a little bit more information for the IT admin, like maybe what app are you currently installing? Would be a nice feature to add in there, but at least at this point, that's not an option. Autopilot V1 finished 5 minutes ago. We're getting pretty close to Autopilot V2 completing.
Just like the, what is it, the surfing thing in Edge when you're offline? Maybe they should just do the Pac-Man in here, right?
41, 100.
Oh, there it is.
Yeah, and that's why that Pac-Man app is in there.
Yeah.
It was one, I covered that at MMS last year, or at an event where I showed how to run Pac-Man during this process.
Nice.
So here we're done in Autopilot V1. After the machine phase, the machine ESP completes, it would automatically log into Windows and continue, except for the reboot. In case of the reboot, it means you need to sign in again. Autopilot V2, there's a new screen added that says required setup is complete. So the end user needs to click next to go past this screen. There's no way of getting rid of this screen. It's not configurable. It always shows up. The interesting thing is, let's say you had in Autopilot V1, you had 8 blocking apps, but you had 20 apps targeted to the machine. Autopilot V1 is going to monitor the 8, but it's still going to install all 20 during the process. So if your 8th app that you're monitoring happened to be the last of 20, bad thing. You had to wait for all 20 of those apps. With Autopilot V2, it's much more intelligent in that if you say block on these 8 apps, it's going to only work on those 8 apps until it gets to this screen. At this point, the process is done. So those other 12 apps will now start to install in the background. So if you just let it sit here on this screen for a long enough period of time, all the additional apps will stream down to the device.
New progress bar for that, right?
No progress bar for that, but you said you didn't want to block on those particular applications, so you got what you want. The interesting thing is, let's say you're like me and you start this process and you walk away from the computer and it sits on this screen after the process is done. I might deploy a machine and not come back to it until the next day to see did it complete. So I finally get to the device and click next. Well, what would next be in a normal autopilot flow? Would be to automatically log in as the user to continue the user process, which we haven't talked about yet, but we'll get into shortly. What happens to an Entra ID token after a period of time? It's no longer good. So you can let it sit on this screen for 24 hours and then click next. It'll fail. It'll fail to automatically log in. You'll get an error message on the screen saying something like invalid request. Hopefully they don't call the help desk, but click OK, and then you have to put your credentials in again. So no way of getting rid of that. Fine. Eventually, maybe. So Autopilot V1, you could block on up to 100 apps. Autopilot V2, they only allow 10. They also added in PowerShell scripts. You can have up to 10 of those. I think you can still have dependencies on those 10, but they're basically saying if you're blocking on more than 10 apps, you're doing something wrong. But basically, they are dictating how you should provision your devices. We've talked about the brain simple progress display. Maybe they'll fix it. And we talked about the poor reinitialization time after a reboot, which hopefully they'll fix shortly.
So you mentioned while you're on this next screen, the other apps can be installing in the background.
Right. And other policies come down and everything else is still happening. So the MDM activity continues, but nothing else. It's just going to sit there in Ubi at that screen.
Like, Michael, what's the point in that?
Sorry?
What's the point in that screen?
Good question.
The blank one, Jerry. That's what I was kidding. What's the point in both?
Why do you need a screen with a button? I don't know.
So I'm curious,
They designed it that way.
maybe you'll cover it as we go, but yeah, I'm curious if you are in front of the system and you hit next and all that other things happening, does it just continue in the user
Just
mode?
continues the background. Yeah.
And I'm trying to read out the statements out there. It does not say that specific time you need to do next or something where it's kind of logical.
All right. So in Autopilot V1, we would be already logging into the computer. In Autopilot V2, the process is done. The autopilot process is done, but it won't continue until you click next. So what do you think happens when you click next? See. Click next. Now you have to choose privacy and security settings. You can't suppress those settings, which is a flaw. I don't know why they didn't do that. You would think that by this point, they know it's an Autopilot V2 device. It's enrolled in a tenant. Intune is going to push down privacy and security settings. Why are you asking the end user for privacy and security settings that are just going to be overridden with the policies? At least I hope they're overridden. If the user chooses some settings that differ from what Intune is pushing down, what happens? I think it'll work, but I don't know for sure. Haven't
Yeah,
tried.
I have a perspective on that. Like we are trying to make a lot of those opt-in options more verbose. Like we don't want to make it under the hood. Like as you mentioned, rightly mentioned, like it's kind of implicit that they would be overridden and you need to go through that. But like as most of the modern privacy thing is coming, we want to just make verbose. Like for example, I run a community of customers, but I have to have them opt in to our privacy policies that they would be joining to my community, and one user would be able to see other users email and connection, right? So they have to, I think it's kind of like
Yeah.
kind of
There's one scenario where it makes sense. Like if you are an enterprise, an org, and you're using Autopilot V2 and you don't push security and privacy settings from Intune, the defaults were bad because it basically opened everything up.
right.
So it would at least establish defaults. But in the 99 percentile case, the enterprise is going to be pushing settings. So you're just getting a false sense of security and control because all the things that you specify are going to be overridden. But minor thing, it's just something that the user still has to click next through, and hopefully that doesn't cause them any heartburn as they're going through it. There is a sequencing, so PowerShell scripts run, then Win32 apps. After that screen appears, then the rest of the stuff just installs in the background. We already talked about that. So now we've gotten to the point we're at the end of Ubi. We're then going to sign on as the user and continue the process. In Autopilot V1, the continuation of the process is the enrollment status page. In Autopilot V2, there is no continuation of the process. It all finished in Ubi. There is no user progress tracking. So it's done as soon as that next button shows up. So there's nothing to show there, but in the Autopilot V1 case, ESP would relaunch and then track anything that's targeted to the user. So Autopilot V2 doesn't have anything yet. Will it at some point? Yes. What will that look like? Based on what Microsoft has shown publicly, it will be the company portal. So you log into the computer, company portal automatically launches, and then the company portal tracks anything remaining that's been targeted to the device. Whether that's a machine apps that still might be installing in the background or anything user targeted that would be installing in the background, the company portal would be able to display what's still happening on the device. And in theory, you as the user could then say, I'll just close it. I don't care. It can continue to run in the background. I don't need to see it. If you really want to know, you can just leave the company portal up on the screen and tracking the progress of everything else. They've shown that publicly in videos. I've not ever seen a live demo of that. I'm not 100% convinced that it was real in the video. I think the code was still being written, but at some point, that's the intent. You log in, company portal launches, company portal tracks the rest of the progress. So Autopilot V1 has ESP, user ESP, Autopilot V2, no user ESP, company portal should take its place. Autopilot V2 actually completed in machine UBI. The next big difference is on the monitoring side. In Autopilot V1, there was a Windows Autopilot deployment preview report that I think has been in preview now for 5 years. Yeah, it has to be 5. It's well over 5 years. Must be 6 by this point, because I left Microsoft 4 years ago and it had been in preview for at least a year at that point. So yeah, we're approaching 6 years at this point for a preview report. So I think it's safe to say that the Autopilot V1 report will never come out of preview. Why? It's a little flaky. The Autopilot V1 report attempts to track an Autopilot provisioning process by reconstructing it from Intune events. So Intune has this big event system behind the scenes, and there's all kinds of events coming through about all the different activities. So it tries to figure out, based on all these events, what happened on the client. But events aren't really designed for reliability. Events are designed for troubleshooting more than anything. So Intune might throw some of those away, and as a result, the report might miss some data and might show a machine that never completed, even though it did, or it failed and it didn't actually show that. So there are things that the APV1 report just can't get right because it doesn't have the data being fed to it by the client directly. It's all indirect via Intune events. Autopilot V2, it is being fed directly by the client. That SLDM provider, I don't know if we ever decided what SLDM stood for, but basically that is the client, the Intune management extension, providing status information directly to the Intune service to populate that report. So it's much more accurate. The Autopilot V2 report, when it came out, wasn't in preview, so they were confident in the data because it was being fed directly by the client. And it's faster because it doesn't need to go through the whole Intune backend. It has basically a direct path. Now, they would say that it's near real time, where Autopilot V1 wasn't really real time, but in my tests, Autopilot V1 generally lagged about 15 minutes behind real time. Autopilot V2, 5 to 6 minutes behind real time. So it's a lot faster, but it's still not true real time. So it's still having to calculate before it displays the data. But you can see the highlighted piece here is the total duration. If you select a particular Autopilot provisioning, device provisioning process, it can tell you how long it took. Did it succeed or not? In the Autopilot V2 case, it's more detailed, prettier. You can see that it was successful, how long it took. And if you click on a particular machine, you can see the app details. Why PowerPoint doesn't want to magnify that for me is a mystery. Yeah, I give up. But the applications there show the apps that were installed, and if you look really closely, there's one of them that's actually gray and it says skipped. Basically, in the Autopilot V2 profile, you could list applications that you want to block, up to 10 of them. But that doesn't mean those 10 apps are actually targeted to the device. You target them separately. So in this case, there was an app that was blocking, but wasn't actually targeted. So it just marks that one as skipped. So the V2 report is done pretty well. As far as I can tell, it's mostly accurate all the time. If you look at the computer names here, you might see things like that if you are testing with the VM over and over again, like I do, where you deploy a machine and you get to the end of it and you revert back to a checkpoint and then you deploy it again. If you keep repeating that cycle, you'll see these machines with GUIDs as computer names. Those are just computers that are tracked, that were tracked at the time, but there's no Intune object anymore for those devices because the device is redeployed and the new Intune object has a different ID. So as a result, you get these kind of orphaned entries that don't display the computer name, but they do actually represent an old deployment. But overall, not too bad. The Autopilot V1 perpetually in preview, 10 to 15 minutes behind. There was also a local diagnostics page in Autopilot V1. If you hit Control-Shift-D while the ESP is displaying, it shows you more information. That was a feature that was being worked on right before I left, and it is in there, but it's not terribly useful, so it doesn't get used very often. There were also the Get Autopilot Diagnostics scripts and a community version of those. Those work with Autopilot V1. They don't work with Autopilot V2. That's something I need to look at. I think we can create a new version that does work with Autopilot V2. But otherwise, all of the troubleshooting for Autopilot V2 is best done remotely through that report that we were just looking at. Troubleshooting locally, it's a little blind locally. Also worth mentioning that when you boot up the device and you get to the keyboard selection page, there is the ability to hit the Windows key 5 times. In Autopilot V1, you get 3 choices, and on 24H2 or above Windows 11 machine, you get 4. And on that 4th option, you can say you want to create a device association for Autopilot V2. So it displays a QR code, and when you click next, in theory, it takes the data from that QR code and says, yeah, your device has been associated with your particular tenant. So that sounds reasonable, but if you actually look at what's in this, which is in an insider build, the QR code that gets displayed, if you actually look at the text, just says test data, test data, test data, test data, test data. It's not a real QR code. It's hard coded. And this progress bar doesn't do anything. It's just counting to 10. And then it displays a hard coded Contoso Inc. company name. So this is just a UI mockup. There's no actual logic behind the scenes that does anything. From Rudy's decompilation of this stuff, he said they're continuing to work on it. He's starting to see more signs of real logic, but so far there's just a placeholder UI in there. So hopefully that'll come at some point, but it has been a year. We haven't seen it yet. All right, so Autopilot V1, you could use the 5X Windows key to start pre-provisioning. With Autopilot V2, eventually you'll be able to associate a device with a tenant. What we expect to happen when that finally occurs, when that's finally added, is it'll tag the device in UEFI with the tenant details, basically to say, I am supposed to be talking to this particular tenant. As a result, you should then be able to optimize Ubi to say, skip the EULA because we know this is a corporate device. Display a branded lock because we know what tenant it belongs to. Skip the security prompts because they're just going to be pushed out via policy anyway. So they have the ability to do that. When? Who knows? But that's the hope. The hope then is that the flow that you use with that QR code will create the corporate device identifier for you, because the QR code should contain the manufacturer, the model, serial number. So that should get fed back to Intune. How that whole end-to-end flow will work, who knows? So it hasn't been finished yet. You should be able to skip the personal versus work school because, again, it knows it's tied to a tenant. So all of that should be possible once they can finish that particular tagging flow. Today, if you buy a device from an OEM, the OEMs can register the device with Autopilot 1. They can't create the corporate device identifier for Autopilot V2 because you would have to delegate access to your Intune tenant to the OEM, and they don't want your credentials to be able to do that, and you probably don't want to give them to them anyway. So in the Autopilot V2 case, you're stuck creating those corporate device identifiers yourself, even if you buy the devices from an OEM that otherwise would have been able to register them with V1. I hope that will change at some point. There's no reason the APIs that the OEMs and resellers use to register a device with Autopilot V1, there's no reason those same APIs couldn't instead create a corporate device identifier in the customer's Intune tenant. So they could fix that, but who knows? One of these years. There's also been kind of this pushback, like in an Autopilot V1 case, customers use this as the device registration piece as a security feature. I know that I can only join devices that are registered with Autopilot as corporate devices to my Intune tenant. In Autopilot V2, they're basically saying this isn't a security feature and shouldn't be treated as one. I think that's just CYA type of thing, but they don't consider this to be a security feature. Now, if you're only going to allow devices with a particular corporate device identifier to enroll, it in effect achieves the same thing. But I think Microsoft would tell you that don't do this for security reasons, do this just for convenience. So yeah, as I initially went through all of this and documented it and figured out what was going on behind the scenes, there's no question that it was the biggest change to Autopilot since it was introduced. Even Microsoft said when they initially announced it, it's still a work in progress and they need to add additional scenarios. The surprising part is how many compromises were made. I mean, some of these could go away and just be temporary, but others seem to be permanent choices. So we'll see what happens. In theory, yeah, putting this all in the Intune management extension lets you enable a greater pace of enhancements, but so far they haven't leveraged that for anything other than bug fixes. As far as I know, they've done 2 bug fixes since the initial release. One to handle localization of the administrator group name. That was entertaining. If you were on an English Windows, admin right delegation worked fine, but on a non-English one, it didn't because the name of the administrator group is different. They fixed that. There was one other, and I don't remember what the other one was, but it was mine. That's pretty much it. Any questions that scrolled through as we were?
I think all questions were addressed, but I welcome anybody come off mute if you'd like. And I threw 2 polls out there. I don't know if we can, I probably can't scroll up there. First one that said, how do you name your systems today? 14% said default, 27% said manually, and 59 said automation of some type. And then I just threw one out there to see, what are people using, if they're using autopilot or not. Let's see if there's any questions though. Feel free to come off mute or throw them in the chat.
Mike, have you seen that?
Yeah, I'd say they're pretty close. If you think about it, most of the work is done by Intune anyway, so it's really a question of what's the quality of Intune, and it's the same Intune in both cases, so it makes sense that it behaves the same. There were earlier issues with Autopilot V1, kind of going back to the sausage making of it was owned by Windows, and then it got moved to Intune, and the services got re-implemented, and that whole mess resulted in lots of reliability issues with the Autopilot V1 service. I think all of that's gone. It used to be that I could track, even after I left Microsoft, I could track the health of the Autopilot V1 service by the number of hits to a particular blog post that I had done. Like if you see this error, something bad happened on the back end. So yeah, every time I would see a spike in that particular blog post, I would know the Autopilot service was down. That hasn't happened in 2 years. So I think Autopilot V1 is very stable. Autopilot V2 doesn't have those back-end service parts. It's just Intune. And Intune itself is pretty solid.
And from a time comparison, is besides that 45 seconds, are they pretty similar in deployment times?
Unless you reboot, yes. If you add in a reboot, there's an extra 5-minute delay. But,
Reboot's mostly going to be big apps.
right. But yeah, otherwise it's logically makes sense that it would be the same. Same apps. They take what they take.
Okay, awesome.
I see a couple comments online where people say that they're installing one app that's a PowerShell script that goes and pulls apps from a CDN and installs. So just scripting around it, basically.
That was my thought.
Yeah, and I saw some of the comments fly by asking about the task sequences that they saw popping up during my Autopilot deployment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was other stuff that I covered in a previous session. You can take an MDT task sequence and embed it into a Win32 app and run a whole series of app installs that way. You can, through the co-management settings, you can have Intune deploy the config manager agent. The config manager agent runs a task sequence. That task sequence installs apps from config manager. That's the flow that, like, the first time I tried out Autopilot, I wanted to get it to work. And it did eventually, years later. I think it took another 5 years before that flow was smooth all the way through. And then Microsoft said, don't do it. Because they don't want you to do co-management. They want you to do cloud native. Everything should be in Intune. Move it all over. Don't use config manager. All right, but if you did, it works out pretty well to have Intune push the config manager agent, the config manager agent run a task sequence. ESP and Autopilot V1 could block on the execution of that task sequence and not complete until that task sequence completes.
V2 not blocked on it?
V2, I don't know of anyone who's tried that. I certainly haven't tried it, but
It seems like until some things in AP get better, that's the ask that I see all the time is push apps as fast and as predictably as possible. And outside of that, it seems like apps sometimes just come down and the OS comes up, and it's not good for a lot of school situations or situations where it boots up, you expect everything to work.
Yeah, we're running into just compliance audits where they want to know, like, the computer is not available to the person until XYZ app is installed.
We're telling people, you can use Word in the browser, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, but we've got audits where they're like, we want to know that your AV is installed, and if it fails, that the device is not usable to the user at all.